Let's jump in. We don't have that much time together, and this is a crash course. So let's dive in. And if there are questions along the way, please do use the chat. I've tried to save some time at the end for us to have a really rich discussion. I don't want this to all just be me talking. I would love to hear from some of you about how you're applying the skill and practice. So first of all, maybe a brief introduction. My name is Stephanie, and I've been a practitioner in the collective impact and network building space for the last 6-7 years in South and Southeast Asia. I'm originally from Indonesia, but my family is in Australia right now. So a lot of my experiences have cut across different cultures. And I have a particular interest in network building because there's such a huge opportunity for us to work together across sectors, across cultures. And I really hope to impart some of what I've learned in that area over to you all in this session. I'm a co-founder of Impact Hub in Jakarta. Impact Hub is a global network of incubators, accelerators, and organizations supporting social change makers like yourselves. And I also currently consult with Second Muse, which is a systems change organization and consultancy. I'm working on a project right now with the Australian government that looks at how we can create collective change through about 30 organizations in South and Southeast Asia that are coming up with new system solutions. And it's very much an experimental lab. So as we talk about some of these skills, I'm deeply, deeply practicing them now and still very much learning. But just a bit of background and intro as to what has brought me here and why I'm so passionate about this area of collective teamwork. So hopefully everyone is in the right room. If so far you've been listening and you've realized, oh no, I'm in the wrong crash course, this session we're going to be talking about collective teamwork. And collective teamwork can be defined in a lot of ways, but the definition that we're arriving to today is really about how do we harness the skill sets and the powers of a collective group and mobilize them around a problem that we can solve together and a solution area. So it's really quite an art and a science of identifying collective opportunities and then mobilizing people around that opportunity as well. So before we go any deeper, I'd love to hear a bit from you. What makes you curious about this skill? Why have you joined this crash course in particular? So your browser open just to jump to menti.com and use this code 79549275. And in Menti, you should be able to pop in a couple of thoughts. I'll give us a couple of minutes to do that. I'll put the instructions in the chat as well, just in case.
Stephanie, what's the code again?
There it is, 79549275. Try that. Let me know if there's any technical issues, but that should. So menti.com, and you can add that code that I've just put in the chat. Great, and as these responses are popping up, let's see here. Ooh, lifetime. Process of suspending judgment, getting work done, overcoming ego. I really like that. Diversity, impact, positive energy, perspectives. Fantastic. How to motivate, how to embrace differences. Scoping problems. Fantastic. So it sounds like at the heart of this is really collaboration, but it sounds like there's a few questions as well. What does it actually mean to formulate teams that can collaborate together and affect change? How do we embrace diversity? How might we overcome ego in collective team environments? And these are great provocations and really fantastic questions to be bringing into this session. Thank you all. That gives me a little bit of an insight into what has brought you here and what are you most curious about. So let's jump back into screen sharing again. Jump back into my slides. I might use this view because it's a little bit easier. So what are we going to be covering today? We're going to go a bit through what is collective teamwork. We've just started to do a bit of brainstorming around that. Why does it matter? Sounds like a lot of you have actually arrived here because you know how important this skill set is. We'll touch on that a little bit. We'll also go through the process. So what does it actually look like to mobilize teams and identify teams? That's usually the big question. What are the principles behind it? And what are some tools that you might actually be able to use right away to start testing this out? We can also, if we have some time, we'll go through a really quick case study. I also have some gifts for you, like a normal conference. You can't leave without a goodie bag. So we're going to give you a virtual goodie bag and save some time at the end for Q&A. But as I mentioned, it is a crash course, so we're going to move pretty fast. I apologize in advance. In terms of housekeeping, again, use the Q&A as much as you like. The lovely co-facilitators I have here from Ashoka will help collate some of those questions so we can address them at the end. And if you are comfortable turning on your video, I love seeing faces. It really helps me feel like I'm not alone in the room. So please do turn on your camera if you are in a position to do so. Okay, let's jump back in. So, why does it matter? Around the world, we're facing more complex challenges than ever before, and we've set some really ambitious goals to tackle these things. If you take any of the global goals for sustainable development, which I think most of you are familiar with, it's a charter and a mandate for how we collectively as a global community can solve some of these challenges, and to give them goals and challenge areas that we can respond to. When we start to look deeply at each of these, they're increasingly interconnected. And there's no one individual or government that's going to be able to solve these challenges. And they're only becoming more complex. So it really requires us to change our approach. We're not just working as individuals within singular organizations anymore. We have the technology, we have the connectivity to really think and act on these solutions in a much more collective way. And I really like this quote: if we want to solve complex social environmental problems, we need to think and we need to act in terms of systems. Systems thinking is an incredible body of thinking that really helps you reframe how you look at some of these challenges and ways that you can tackle social and environmental challenges. Really encourage you to do a little bit more reading on that. We won't be able to go into too much detail, but what we will be thinking about today is how do we act in terms of systems? How do we participate in systems? How do we lead in a systems orientation? And I like this reframing of the Sustainable Development Goals because it really demonstrates the interconnectivity of these issues. We have environmental, social, and people-based economies, and we are all interrelated. And so it goes, we should be looking at solutions from all of these different lenses as well. So I tend to look at this model because it reminds me of how interconnected they are. They're not separate blocks necessarily. So back to what I was sharing before, if we look at the world as this interconnected system and all of our challenges that we're facing are interconnected, we need to shift and fundamentally shift the way that we solve these problems and we look at these problems. Our traditional models of building organizations that tackle issues like this, whether you're an NGO or social enterprise, has often looked more like this diagram on the left. It's looked more like a hierarchy. Even our educational systems tend to look a little bit more like this as well. So this is our primary reference point most of the time when we think of organizations and we think of organizational change. But as you can see, hierarchical pyramid structures means that this team here on the left is disconnected from the team on the right. So the flow of this information and the flow of ideas is not moving across fluidly. And it also means that in this structure, whatever a company or an organization is learning is only contained within that organization. There are very few means for them to look beyond their organization and discover different strengths and combine different strengths. What we're talking about today in terms of collective teamwork and networks of teams rather than individual teams and organizations is what does it look like for us to reframe the resources we have available, the types of people we can work with as beyond your singular organization or your singular team. And in order for us to tackle these complex and messy challenges, we have to change our own structures to do that. So we're going to be diving into a really deep paradigm shift. I want you to all put on this hat of what does it look like for us to operate in a network of teams instead of hierarchies. And it is going to require us to shed a little bit of that existing notions of what it is to participate in a school environment, a university environment, or traditional models of organizations and companies that you might come from. So it's really that art of that teamwork. If we look at these complex challenges as something we've never encountered before, we should be using different ways of addressing these problems as well. That's how we're going to get solutions that don't yet exist. So let's dive back into coming back and returning to collective teamwork and what does this mean. We're gonna talk about the how, because I'm pretty sure everyone in this room, you know, you're here because you're curious about it. You're here because you're looking to develop these change-making skills. And you're here because you want to know, well, how do I exactly do this? And as I mentioned before, it's a little bit of an art. It's a little bit of a science. There are no ground rules, but I will be sharing what has really worked for me in the processes that I've tried and with different organizations that I've collaborated with. I think another important point to stress is also diversity. A few of you mentioned that diversity is something you're trying to understand. How do we engage with diversity more? And it is difficult and it's complex, but there are definitely ways to do it. I know a lot of organizations that shy away from it because it feels very intimidating. Challenges as well. So I thought about when trying to describe the how, there was a couple of ways to do this. And I thought I could show you a boring framework in a box, but you probably won't remember it. So instead, I'm going to show you a burger because I think you'll remember the burger. So as I mentioned, it's a bit of an art and a science collaboration. But basically, there are three core elements that help you take a collective teamwork-based approach or a collective network approach. The heart of it is in the process. Following a particular process to take an experience with a group of people is really the heart of this. So let's say the process is the patty, and it's a plant-based patty, of course. And then next you have the principles. Principles are the foundations that really ensure that the process moves smoothly. So it really holds that burger together. That's the bun. You need really strong principles to engage in a process of collective teamwork, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then lastly, you have the tools. Tools is the sauce. It's really what makes the experience really inviting and energizing and fun and collaborative. There's a whole range of different sauces, different tools you can use, and you can decide on what you like and how complex you want it to be. But that's really the cherry on the top that makes this collaborative experience building really powerful. So I'm gonna reference the burger model. Don't think it's ever been done before in collective teamwork or collective impact, but we'll give it a go. So let's jump into processes and tools. There's roughly about 7 steps that I would encourage, and I'm gonna go through the process and I'm gonna share an example of a tool that you can use to apply that process. So if you think about it as 7 steps, the first step in any endeavor to set collective, to garner the collective interest of a group is set an intention. This is your purpose, your call to action. This is where your idea and intent to create change is sparked. So some of the things you need to think about here is, what is the problem you are trying to solve and why are you trying to solve it? You need to be very clear and compelling and demonstrate an understanding of what that issue area is. And back when I used to work in crowdfunding, one of the important aspects of this is storytelling to an extent. Setting an intention is really setting a desire to say, this issue really matters, and I'd like to bring a collective group of people together to tackle this challenge. And why this issue and why now? They're adding a sense of urgency into that issue area. It's really important to help set that guiding force and intention. What can help you shape these intentions? So a tool that I constantly come back to, it's very, very simple, and some of you may have seen this before, is Simon Sinek's Golden Circle, which encourages you to really start with the why. And we say here, start with intention rather than solution. And I'll come back to that in a second, why this is important. But it's important here to not jump to solutions when you are starting a collective process. Number 2 is identify your needs. It's really important to be humble here and to think about within yourself and within your team, what skill sets, perspectives are missing, and where are there gaps that you need to fill. So this will vary depending on the issue area that you're working on. If it's, of course, a more technical area, you might consider needing more technical expertise. If this is an issue where you're looking with a lens of global collaboration, do you have the representation you need across cultures? Do you have equal and fair gender representation? So these are all the perspectives that strengthen a solution. Having more diverse voices can really strengthen and make a solution much more resilient. So a few tools, and don't worry, I have links to all of these that I'll share with you as well. There's a tool I love called Full Circle Leadership, a very simple framework for you to identify the archetypes and the different types of people who are in your current team. What are their strengths and what might be missing? In terms of visualizing this, especially if you're working in large teams, I encourage you to do this in a visual way. And Kumu is a really, really great visual mapping tool. So you can start to see where there are balances and imbalances in your structure and in the skill sets that you have. Step 3. So now you've identified what your intention is, who needs to be on board. Now, how do you get them on board? This sometimes can be the trickiest bit, but what needs to happen is you need to structure very clear invitations to participate. Be really clear about expectations and commitments. Nowadays, there are so many different distractions, and there's so much going on in the world. People do really respect direct clarity and being really clear about expectations, but it doesn't mean you have to be too rigid. I like to provide different levels of participation. It also means that you can increase that diversity. There are so many different boundaries and barriers to how people might be able to participate, but generally thinking about 3 levels of participation, giving people the option and the agency to choose how they want to be involved can be a really important part of making this more inclusive. And then think about also what is in it for them. It doesn't have to be financial, but really thinking about, as an organization or as an individual, what is the learning experience that might come from this? What is the collective credibility or collective impact that can be generated through this? Make sure that when you structure the ask and the invitation, that there's a shared value component. You're sharing value in this endeavor together. In terms of tools, nothing too fancy. I think it really comes down to how you prefer to communicate. If you do have structured levels of how people communicate or opt in to different levels, using a simple survey tool like Typeform is really effective and quite fun. It doesn't have to be a boring survey. It can be something quite engaging and playful. Step number 4. Okay, so you've set up your invitations. You had people opt in and say, yes, I'm in and I want to work on this with you. Determine your ways of working together. So this is the heartbeat and the engine of collaboration. It's how well you work together. And so much of this is learned through practice. But when we talk about ways of working, we're talking about setting up the right foundations for working well together and cultivating trust. One of the first things I like to do, particularly with a group of people who have never worked together before, is really understanding what are their preferences? How do they like to work together? What are our shared agreements and shared values? This can be as simple as creating a charter of agreements together. And I have a couple examples I'll link to you. It can be as simple as an activity and a tool here that's mentioned called the user manual activity. This invites you to imagine yourself in a box, and if I unpack the box and I read the user manual, what would the user manual tell me about Jasmine, for example? Or what would it tell me about Wira if I open that manual? And it gives us a chance to see each other as human beings who are participating in a collective process, and to get to know each other and respect the ways that we prefer to work with each other as well. And I would say it's particularly important when you have cross-cultural groups and settings and with people who've never worked before, so you don't make assumptions about the best way to go about something. And it also helps you think about how you might reduce barriers to participate. Back to inclusivity, people, especially when we're working virtually, we sometimes don't see these things as clearly as we did before. So really pushing you to not assume that there's one way of working, but creating a collective agreement as a group together. Okay, so we're at step 5, co-creating a shared plan. So remember at the beginning, step 1 was set an intention, but don't set a plan. And that was really intentional because at this stage, when you form the group together and you've started the heartbeat has started, you've started getting together, you've set your ways of working and collective agreements. Now it's really important to allow that intention to be shaped into a plan and a vision that creates a sense of ownership and identity with the group. So this helps everyone in the group feel that they have participated and that they have buy-in into the initiative that you're working on. At the beginning, when you invite everyone into a collective structure, you're merely the facilitator. You're really kind of the catalyst that sparked it. But in terms of the driving force, it's really important here that you also enable others to step up and really invest in this solution area and this initiative in the same way. It's really important to be transparent here as well. This is that you might create out of this is a shared manifesto, which becomes your new plan moving forward and setting these collective goals together. This will be quite dependent on what initiative you're working on, but the principle here is that it's really important to co-create this rather than creating it alone, which is what a typical organization might do. Step 6, distribute your leadership. So remember when we looked at the typical hierarchical models, leadership is usually at the top and it filters down. What we're talking about in collective teamwork approaches is completely reshaping that model. It means putting leadership at the center and distributing it across different people. In these networked approaches, remember, you are both a participant and a facilitator, but you're not the boss in a sense. And this is important because this is how collective approaches thrive. Collective approaches don't work when there's one person driving the bus. So a couple of ways you can do this is in decentralizing decisions. And there are certain decisions you should be decentralizing and certain decisions that are less appropriate. We can talk about that in a bit later. And there's different ways you can empower teams. I once was leading a collective team of about 48 people, which is huge. And it became really clear that we needed to decentralize this. So one approach that we took was we created smaller structures, microstructures within this team. So we had smaller pods of about 4 people, and then we had a leader for each of those pods. So that's a really practical way in which you can decentralize and empower people in these structures, as well as to create smaller groups. And that might be based on country. It might be random, or it might be based on interest areas. But think about how you can rejig those structures to really empower people to own and participate in these networks. There's 2 tools I would suggest. There's a great simple tool called Lean Coffee. So if you're organizing a meeting and there's 20 people on the call, and it feels very hard to make sure everyone has a voice, there are really good examples of ways that you can facilitate these meetings where everyone has input into what should be prioritized in that meeting and what you spend that time on. So that refers to Lean Coffee. Again, I'll share all these tools with you afterwards as well. The last step, the final step, is always iterate. Network collaboration and collective impact is a messy, messy process. I'm not gonna lie, it's quite a messy process, but it's incredibly rewarding. One of the biggest things you need to do is constantly learn and iterate and respond. So one of the ways you can do this is at different marks in your journey. So if you're running a project for 12 months, maybe every month you might conduct a retrospective. Retrospective is when you look back with your team and you assess what worked well, what didn't work well, and what have you learned. It doesn't have to be a big process. In fact, in our teams, we just build it into our regular cadence and regular structure in terms of how we work. So do these regularly because it gives you a chance as a facilitator to respond to that feedback and make changes where it's necessary. And this really improves the experience for everyone and it makes them feel heard in the process of being part of this team. It's also about cultivating a growth and learning mindset. We don't take collective impact approaches because they're easy. We take them because we believe it's the right way to tackle these problems, and there's so much we can learn from it. So if we keep ourselves humble and open to this learning, we can get so much more out of the experience, and your team can as well. So there's a very simple tool if you're doing this retrospective online, a very simple tool called Fun Retro that can help facilitate that and actually make it quite light and quite fun as well. Great, so we just went through the burger, coming back to the burger. So that's the process. The process is really at the core. And I want to go through some of the principles that really hold this process together. These are principles that you potentially as a leader or co-facilitator, someone who's participating in this process needs to remember collective teamwork to be possible. So just a couple to touch on. One is move at the speed of trust. What do we mean by that? With any collective team, depending on how much time you've spent with each other, your level of trust will be different. And when we collaborate, we're collaborating as humans with one another. It's so important, and where it's possible, try to invest in this trust building upfront, even before a project has started. If you've already identified the types of people you want to work with, take time to meet them one-on-one. Take time to connect on a social and human level. It doesn't have to always be about work, but trust me that that investment really pays off because collective teamwork is really built on these foundations of trust. And if you find that the group or your initiative is not moving as fast as you'd hope, it is a sign that you need to maybe slow down and build a bit more trust into this group first. And that's a big part of the second principle of embracing emergence. This is all about embracing what emerges, noticing where a group's energy wants to go, rather than being very prescriptive about what the end goal has to be and how you have to go about it. Third, be responsive to the needs of the group. Don't be afraid to iterate and change. Be really open about what you're learning through the process with your group. That level of vulnerability has always helped A, build trust in the team, but B, ensure that everyone is having a positive experience. Fourth, be really clear about the roles you play. Some of the biggest failures, I suppose, or lessons that I've learned through these collective teamwork processes is people don't feel very clear about the role that they're playing, and then they hesitate to participate. And personal circumstances will change. I mean, we all have other commitments. There's so much going on in the world. Have flexibility as well, and have clear roles, but make sure people understand that there are ways to change their role depending on their life situation as well. This is at the bottom, but it's probably actually one of the most important ones, is be human. It sounds really simple. It is simple, but it is really powerful. Again, when we're collaborating one-on-one as human beings. Showing up with that trust, that respect, that mutual support goes a really long way in these settings. And sometimes in the busyness of trying to get to that final goal, we forget this principle so much. So be human. It goes a long way. And then lastly, be comfortable with the complexity. We just went through all of these processes, and it might sound like, wow, there's a lot, and there's so many things that can happen in an emergent process, but try to be comfortable with it, and know that there's no one way of getting to that end goal. There's many ways to get there, and have fun. Have fun within the complexity as much as possible. It really sets the tone for the rest of the group as well. So that's what keeps it together. I'm just looking at the time, and I think we should probably jump into Q&A. If you can, pop into the chat. I'd love to hear, what are you working on right now where you're applying a collective teamwork approach? Or based on what has been shared, where do you think you might apply a collective teamwork approach? So I'd love to hear your comments in the Zoom chat. And while you're filling that in, I did promise a take-home gift. So here's your virtual gift. I built a little toolbox, a virtual toolbox with all of the links to the tools that I just shared in those processes earlier. You can access it through this if you type it in your browser, bit.ly teamwork toolbox. And there's also a humanizing virtual facilitation and humanizing virtual spaces guidebook that I co-wrote with a couple of friends in the ecosystem. Hopefully that can also be a useful resource, because it really does come back to, again, being human, and it might be a useful guide for you as a facilitator. So 2 little take-home gifts there. I hope that it can be handy for you. I can share these links as well afterwards, but without further ado, we should probably jump into Q&A. I've been talking for quite a while. So
Right, so we have a few questions in the chat for you, Stephanie. The first one is from Isabella, who asks, what are the challenges that one could potentially face when implementing the structures and frameworks which you brought up during the session?
It's a great question. There are a lot of challenges that one might face. I think it really depends on the level of trust that you have with a group. There's generally more challenges when it's a new group, and nowadays everything is virtual. Most things are virtual, and that has come with its own set of challenges. How do you build trust in virtual environments? How do you share information transparently and openly? How do you apply these things and really understand the feedback? I personally, I'm a much better communicator in person, because I can really understand through visual cues and body language how someone is feeling. And that can be a very big challenge in virtual spaces. So you might find that you're moving too fast through a process without realizing that you're moving too fast for the group. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, having the feedback loop, which is why the last step, retrospectives, having frequent retrospectives is so important as well.
Right. Next, we have a question from Vivian, who asks, how do you maintain coherence and alignment across the pods? And I believe this is with reference to the lean meetings.
Fantastic question. I love the pod structures. I actually use them not just in my collective work at work. I actually use pods as a way for me to also connect with my social friendships as well. In terms of coherence, usually depending on the size of the pod, I found the The optimal size is somewhere between 4 and 5. You wouldn't want to make a pod greater than that because somehow, not sure if this is scientific, but it changes the dynamic. It changes the ability for people to participate as well as the group gets bigger. And another aspect is when I was mentioning managing this large group of about 48 participants, we had a lead for each of those pods. And that lead really represented the needs of the group, generally a person who had a bit more capacity to lean in and share those insights up with me as the facilitator. So just having those dual structures really helped with the coherence so that those feedback loops were going up and coming back down to the pods as well, and everyone felt heard and respected.
Okay, so next we have a question from Nurul, who asks, how does the structure that you've suggested affect the motivation of the team? And how can we maintain it over time? And if you have your own experiences with it, could you walk us through those as well?
So I'm currently working on a project which is a 6-month-long design, collaborative design lab, where we form these teams and they're designing and developing prototypes for new solutions. And many of these teams have never worked with each other before. And I think it's been harder to get a sense of motivation from these teams because they haven't had that trust built at the beginning. So I think that's really tough, but in terms of maintaining it over time, again, I do go back to these feedback loops because if people are losing motivation, there's usually a reason behind it. It might be a personal reason. It might be an environmental reason. It might be about the way that the process is structured. But the only way to alleviate it is to learn and understand why it's happening. So building in these feedback loops is a way that you can respond to low motivation and build it up. Sometimes I ask really directly to the group and crowdsource their ideas of what would actually make this process more motivating to you. But you really need to, before making assumptions, just try to diagnose the challenge and diagnose why this group is not as motivated anymore. And chances are, it's probably something environmental, or it might be something personal that's happened a lot. And it really pays to just sit and listen and be with that person or with those people who are losing that motivation.
Great. So next, Praveen says his team has different ideas as to how to bring their own project forward, and they all seem to have various spaces of work. So do you have any suggestions about how he can help inspire his teammates better, or should he be the one who needs to slow down his pace?
That's a really great question. I often find myself in a group with many different personalities, and one person might want to go 100 kilometers an hour, the other one wants to go 60 kilometers an hour. I would say this comes back to setting up really good agreements up front and ways of working. So I'm not sure how big the team is, but if you have an opportunity to bring the team together and really acknowledge these things up front. So I'm noticing that that some of us have more capacity and more energy and maybe want to meet 4 times a week. And I'm noticing that that's not possible for some people. How might we find an agreement where, we're moving at a pace that suits all of us? What does that pace look like? Maybe it's meeting 2 days a week instead of 4 days a week. But having those, you're not alone in having to make those decisions yourself. You're really in a good position to be able to notice those things and surface some of those tensions. And usually in high trust environments, you can really surface those tensions with the group and ask them to work through it with you. But I would check out a ways of working framework and the user manual frameworks. I think those could be really helpful in helping your team identify their preferences and then come up with a collective group preference that everyone agrees to, that feels like it suits everyone.
All right, I believe we have time for one final question from Ben, who asks how to build a better rapport and relationship among the members of his team.
That's a great question, Ben. And you might be referring also to a virtual environment, which is, I'd love to hear what's working for all of you as well. So do chime into the Q&A if you have ideas for this. But building rapport in the relationship in the team, I always buffer about 10, sometimes 15 minutes at the start of calls to hear how everyone's doing and catch up at a human level. Sometimes there's a prompt, sometimes it's a little bit silly, and it does cost 10, 15 minutes of your meeting time, but it creates a different layer of connection. And it gives people a pressure release valve. I think with back-to-back Zoom meetings, everyone is really feeling rushed to show up a certain way. And if you can create the space for a team to connect at a human level, even if it might cost in productivity, it is worth it because you really build up that trust more, and the rapport is really is built from there, the foundations of that. The other thing is that it does take time. It's unfortunately not something that can be forced too much, but the product of collective teamwork is often what builds that rapport the best. Some of the teams who have seen that they have succeeded together have a lot more confidence in these processes as well. One thing we've tried is setting small mini milestones. So if your goal is a really big goal at the end of 6 months, one of the things I've done is set smaller milestones and actually congratulate, like we celebrate wins on all of those smaller milestones together, rather than waiting until the very end when we've hit that big giant goal. So think about how that might also, celebration is such a beautiful act of us coming together and having that camaraderie. So that might be an interesting way to build that in.